Hey, welcome back to the MMA Prospectus. We are live once again. I am Dane Simon of Bloody Elbow. I'm joined by my esteemed cohort, Tom Grant, also of Bloody Elbow. And we are talking everything in the world of prospects and MMA development and all that kind of good stuff with a special focus on U- the UFC, just because these days the UFC is so huge that honestly, I don't know, it just felt right to have a prospect show that focuses mostly on the guys who are rising up the ranks. You know, when you got 100 welterweights and 100 lightweights out there, there's a lot of room for guys to come in at the bottom and work their way up. This card that we got in front of us today, the UFC Saskatoon card, headlined by Max Holloway versus Charles Oliveira, is really talent rich with young and developing fighters. So we got a lot to talk about today. Just in terms of that, we might address some other things too. But first and foremost, Tom, thank you for joining me. Who are you most excited to see on this card?
Nikki Thrills. Like, is that even a question?
Always Nikki Thrills.
Always Nikki Thrills. That is always the correct answer.
And you were a Thrills hater. I remember when Nikki Thrills made his UFC debut, you were like, man,
Oh,
this dude is trash.
there's a fiery rack at the end of this hype train, like to be sure. But I'm riding it as long as we can because it's just fun.
It is.
I'm not convinced Nikita Krylov. I mean, obviously Nikita Krylov's not going to become a title contender anytime soon.
No.
Um, I'm honestly surprised he's done as well as he has, but he's been putting together something. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it's been something.
He's
Uh,
got that great mix of intangibles that we as analysts in general hate to think about because I think it overly distills the sport in a way that we'd like to admit it we'd like not to admit can be distilled, which is that he's big and he's tough. Like those two things, he's a legit sized light heavyweight and he's tough as nails. And those two, and he's got even a little bit of decent cardio. Those three things together make him a much more successful fighter than you would otherwise expect. I mean, he's essentially light heavyweight's Cathal Pendred, but with an exciting go for broke style.
yeah, and I mean, I think moving. I don't remember if he fought at heavyweight
Yeah, he
before.
started out at heavyweight.
Yeah, getting down to light heavyweight was a good move for him. And I think it was one of those things too that like the fact that he gave Soapolele a back and forth fight, which was like an amazing, like straight up gong show sort of performance, where it was just like the only thing that fight was missing was someone slipping on a banana peel. But it was also one of those things that I mean, Soapolele is a legitimate like mid-level heavyweight in the UFC at this point, and the fact that Nikita Krylov went back and forth with him so much is kind of an indicator that like Krylov was better than I was giving him credit for when he first came into the UFC. I think the OSP loss, highlights some deficiencies that I think are still likely there. Though Oven St. Cruz also showed a talent for finding that Von Flue shoulder choke. He almost put Glover Teixeira out with it. So there's a little bit of that going on too. But I'm actually excited to see Nikita Krylov on there. He's gotten what appears to be on a really intense strength and conditioning program because he looks bigger and stronger every time he gets in there. I don't remember if he is associated with a major camp now. Or he's still fighting out of the Ukraine.
He is. I believe he's still with the same coaches, but they are working to move him around a little and get him better coaching. Like they took him. I think his last fight, he spent time out of Ukraine working with like the Latvian wrestling team, national wrestling team, some things like that. And that's actually one of the reasons that I'm interested in him because, he's somebody who came into this sport just 3 years ago now. So still very much new to MMA, despite having a good record. I mean, he fought like 12 times in his first year of competition. Um, but he came to the sport just 3 years ago, and it sounds like his coaches know what his problems are.
Yeah.
Like they know that he needs work to become a better fighter, and that's always a good thing to hear. You never want to, at least in my mind, especially when a guy's at a smaller camp, you never want to hear their coach say, "This guy's a killer. He's a future title contender. He can do anything out there, and I believe that he'll be the greatest." Like I can believe he can compete with anyone. Like
Yeah.
I honestly don't want to hear that. If it's a small camp, if it's a guy coming out of nowhere, I want that coach to be a little more realistic and be like, look, we know we got to get him some better coaching with X, Y, and Z, because there's usually big obvious flaws in fighters' games who come out of nowhere.
And I mean, and to their credit, they're not exactly coaching him poorly in all facets of the game, really. I mean, like can't say I don't know who like per se like who his coaches are, but they've given him a pretty solid striking arsenal at this point. He's got a nice kicking game. I mean, he's got a striking arsenal that complements his body type really well. He's got a really nice kicking game that operates really, really well from the outside. He's got some pretty decent hands, and he is not like at all afraid to ugly it up inside. And I mean, like he got a submission game, but it's not really anything like it's not complete. He's got a lot of holes on the ground, but he kind of it very much seems like he kind of comes from more of like a sambo sort of background in the sense that like he is more trained for like a couple of seconds on the mat, grab something up if it's there, if not, reset on the feet. And he seems to be getting better at establishing that game in his actual fights, like really forcing the action back to the feet or snatching, or like in the Nedkov fight, like snatching an opportunity and taking full advantage of it.
Yeah, it is something I'm interested in this fight he's got against Lima, who is on the fringes of still being a prospect at this point. He's been around long enough that he's just at that point where we should be starting to expect to see his game click, and it may take longer for him. I often think that it takes a little longer for guys who are especially power punching strikers. It takes sometimes a little longer for their games to really click into place because striking is just harder to learn, and they can usually get by for longer on their striking, so that they don't, it takes longer. When the technique clicks, they're suddenly much better fighters than they were even a couple fights ago. So I could see De Lima still being in that progression, but it is an interesting thing to me. Like I do wonder if Marco Sergio de Lima's coaches or Marco Pezau's coaches feel like he's got as many gaps and are working as hard to fill those gaps as Krylov, because I do feel like Krylov has improved a lot from fight to fight, whereas de Lima, he still kind of looks like the same guy that lost to Mike Kyle,
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I'm De Lima's another guy that's really intriguing because, as you said, like he's on the end of kind of being like a prospect, and he's hitting the point where he kind of is what he is at this point, and he'll be able to. And that's not a bad fighter by any stretch of the imagination. He's really quite an excellent fighter, but a lot more was expected of him when he was rolling into Strikeforce back in 2011, and I still don't have a high, like I still don't think there's a very high ceiling you need to be as a fighter to beat Nikita Krylov.
No.
But Krylov is going to go kicking and screaming.
And the thing is that there aren't a lot of light heavyweights who have a very high ceiling. That's that truth.
And I mean, as I've said, Krylov has firmly established himself as a guy who is a competitor at the international level of MMA, which is not like for all the crap we give fighters when they reach UFC and don't look that good. I mean, everyone at this level is pretty darn good.
Yeah. So we've spent now way too much time talking about
no such thing as too much time on Nikita Krylov.
I know. We had to spend some time with Nicky Thrills because, quite frankly, he's just one of those fighters that I really enjoy rooting for. Guys who are just out and out aggressive and seem to have no real sense of self-preservation when they fight at all. But we got a lot more legit prospects to talk about, namely starting things off, Misha Serkinov. He's fighting Daniel Jolly, who I don't know if you've seen some tape on Jolly, but he reminds me of kind of like I'm gonna say B grade Manawa, Jimmy Manawa, but what I really mean is like basically a fighter, where Manawa was in development, that good athlete who is working on a limited striking and takedown, top control, ground and pound arsenal with a high energy one with some real ability to put stuff together.
Yeah.
Who else? I guess you could say. I'm trying to think who else fights really a lot like that right now. And basically, he just looks like a really raw fighter. That's the easiest way to say. He looks like a good athlete, but a raw talent. And Serkinov is a hot prospect.
Yeah, it is. The show's going to open with this fight, and it is a rare prospect matchup at light heavyweight of guys who are both pretty good, but both kind of have their problems. And I think you highlighted Jolly's pretty well. He is a really good athlete, and very clearly the UFC is kind of, at least in my eyes, when they pick up a guy like this, you're getting into the long haul with this guy. You're going to keep him on the roster for at least like 3 years to see where he's at. Because, I mean, like, we're talking about a guy that is, only has 5 fights since 2000 and started his career in 2011 and still has a lot of developing to do as like a technical fighter, but could be something of a pretty solid guy in the division that they really need new faces in the top 10 and they really need him. And Misha is the kind of the much more finished product. He's coming out of I'm not sure how to approach Extreme Couture anymore as a camp. Like, they used to be one of the major camps, and now I'm not really sure how to like.
Well, more specifically, he's coming out of Extreme Couture Toronto. So he's not even coming out of Extreme Couture.
Okay, that's not denoted on anything I have here. So, all right. So then I would say that he's most likely, that's not a huge major camp. He's got connections then, but Misha's game is really really focused right now. He wants to get to the clinch, and he has a large amount of high-impact takedowns from there. He's coming from a judo wrestling background. He's got a pretty slick game on the mat, has done some things in no-gi grappling. Nothing huge, but is, known around as, a pretty good competitive professional grappler. So the matchup here is going to be interesting. I think Misha's probably the guy who's going to walk away the winner here. But it's possible that we see Jolly down the road making big strides just because of his athleticism and if he's able to kind of catch on somewhere or kind of sharpen up his game. But I think Misha's more high level ready now. Like, he can be the guy that we can slot into the top 10 sooner rather than later if he hits on all cylinders and get a fresh face in there with some of the bigger names in the division, so that we're not running Ryan Bader and OSP back out there to fight for the 5th time in the next 6 years. But I think this should be an interesting one in which both guys kind of hang around in the division for a good while and names that we'll become familiar with down the road.
Yeah, I hope so. I think Serkinov is somebody who should be able to get to the top 10 pretty quickly, just because, like I say, the outside the top 10 is not a hard place to climb. That's not a steep ladder.
The fun thing about Serkinov, and you brought this up before we started the show, is that he plays a game that's very much against the type of game played at light heavyweight right now.
Mm-hmm.
Weight classes kind of have their own kind of specific meta games that exist, and I think most MMA fans have kind of figured this out. That light heavyweight right now, there's not a lot of guys who really look for the takedown and look for the submission the way Kirchhoff does. There's not we kind of had it in Phil Davis. John Jones was that guy for a little while, but he kind of backed off it. It's really more of a division in which everyone kind of tries to learn how to strike, and learn how to deliver that one big, powerful punch. And he's kind of like a mold breaker in there, and that could make him a really intriguing matchup for a lot of fighters as well. Like even if he does get to that level of being like a top 10 fighter, which I think it's pretty easy for him to get up there. Like as you said, I think he makes for an interesting matchup with a lot of guys just because he fights differently than most people at that weight class.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I think he presents a lot of problems just because it is a division where guys do not have. You don't see a lot of guys with a really evolved ground game at all. And on the other side, I think Jolly, his big question is really just going to be his chin. Otherwise, he reminds me. I guess you could say he reminds me a lot of an athletic version of. Oh God, who's the light heavyweight that is Krylov beat him? No, not. Let's see. Damn it.
Wall Harris?
The Sean O'Connell.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of like Sean O'Connell as a plus athlete.
Okay. Yeah.
Aggressive, gonna try and get in the pocket, throw a few strikes, and then shoot for a takedown, and a basic game. And O'Connell has done surprisingly way, way, way better than I thought he would, just purely through having a good chin and being able to take punishment. So anyway, we spent a lot. We're kind of getting stuck in these things, but there are a lot of fighters I want to talk about on this card. Next one up, even just next fight, is Elias Silverio. He's somebody that, I think unfairly, it seems like almost has, if not been forgotten, or if not lost shine, been kind of forgotten since his loss to Rashid Magomedov, which was an exposing loss. It showed that Silverio isn't nearly as complete a striker as he needs to be to run up the ladder. But I think it should also underscore just exactly how incredibly good Rashid Magomedov is.
Yes, I think that was a very much a legitimizing win for Magomedov, more so than an indictment of Silverio, I feel like. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to see in November Magomedov and Burns. I think that's going to be fantastic. And I'm still surprised that Burns is doing ACCs. I'm still kind of surprised that he's taking in kind of the lead up to a pretty big step up fight. But that's kind of a side thing. Silverio, he's a fairly complete fighter for he's got surprisingly good wrestling when you consider the guys fighting out of he's still fighting out of Sao Paulo, is he not? Or out of Brazil?
Yeah, I think he's got his own team there, Elias Silverio team, and he bounces around to some other gyms and camps. I'm not sure if he's hooked up with anyone better lately, but he definitely just seems to be kind of doing his own thing down there in Brazil.
Yeah. And just frequently speaking, offensive wrestling is not usually a huge priority for Brazilian fighters. You'll see a lot of very solid defensive wrestlers come out of Brazil, but usually the offensive wrestlers are kind of the really, really big guys who are going to grind you into the fence and then just kind of drag you to the mat through sheer attrition. So he's got a surprisingly good offensive wrestling game, and then obviously his top game kind of goes along with that. And he's got good striking. He's a good athlete. I think he's an intriguing guy for 155 pounds. It's just that you're fighting at lightweight, and we kind of talked about it last time. You need in addition to amazing athleticism, you need one standout skill that's better than pretty much anyone else. And I'm not sure Silverio has that. He's kind of like a jack of all trades. And that'll get you places in lightweight, but you're going to do so in a somewhat unremarkable way at times. And so I kind of feel like that might be Silverio for a little bit here as he kind of adjusts to the UFC, is kind of like unremarkable performances at times, but I think we're going to see steady improvement from him. I would not be shocked if he took out Shane Campbell in this fight.
Yeah, I mean the things he has going for him. It's interesting to see that he's only listed at being 5'9", because watching him, seeing him in the cage, he always looks like a pretty huge lightweight. Like he's
Yeah.
really powerfully built, and it's just and he came in kind of focused on having a pretty good Muay Thai game. He was the kind of guy who was constantly pushing the pace, really aggressive, going after people. It's just that he's got technical holes in that game. He overreaches his feet a lot. He's not the most defensively sound fighter in the world. But as good as like Shane Campbell as a technical striker, as good as he is, I don't think he's the kind of athlete that's gonna test somebody as big and powerful as Silverio.
Yeah.
I mean, Campbell got kind of pushed around by John McDessie, who, while a good athlete, is one of the more undersized lightweights out there. So this is, I think Silverio, he's one of those fighters. We'll see if his striking can progress over time. And the fact that he's not at a big camp, at least that I know of, that doesn't say good things over the long term, but it could mean that he does pretty well getting up to like the fringes of the top 15, getting to that top 20-ish kind of area where where it starts to become really important that you've never quite mastered one technical aspect of the fight.
Yeah.
Let's see. After that, jump up. Briefly talk about Frankie Perez, who's going to take on Sam Stout. This is a fight that I'm interested in, just because I really am not at all sure if Frankie Perez can beat Sam Stout. Like, it's a great opportunity as a prospect to get a fighter like Stout. He's a great get-over name, somebody people recognize. You get to headline the prelims against him. But I don't know. Perez is another one of those guys who, like we've talked about as a lightweight, doesn't really have like that one super dominant go-to aspect of his game. Or if he does, it was grappling regionally, and that's the one that's you're likely to get the least mileage out of in the UFC.
Yeah, Frankie Perez, I'm a little concerned about this matchmaking too, because Sam Stout is a really tough. Like especially when you're a grappler, getting a guy who's been around the game this long, that's a tough matchup. A guy who likes to brawl on the feet, who's been fighting for, Stout's been fighting professionally over 10 years at this point.
Yeah.
Just a wealth of experience to fall back on, both in the grappling sense and, in terms of just MMA craft in general. He's been building it for over a decade. Because, we're talking about a guy who's been fighting for over a decade. You're going to try, mat time is mat time to a certain extent. Regardless of how focused you are on it and how, your coaches and, whatever, a decade of mat time is valuable. And it makes you, really tricky to, it usually will make people, they'll be really defensively solid at that point. Stout isn't an amazing offensive grappler, but I can count on one hand the number of times I can remember him being submitted. There was James Krause getting that guillotine choke on him 2 years ago, and I don't even remember the last time he got submitted before then.
Yeah, it's Kenny Florian way back in 2006.
Yeah, and I don't. Controlling him for long periods on the mat, that's another problem. So.
It's also grappling and wrestling tends to be one of the last things that go for fighters as they get older.
Yeah,
because you get that body contact with the person, you get to use your strength comes more into play, and it's a little like the muscle memory. I think just works a little better than when you're moving on the outside and having to be the faster man. You don't have to be the faster grappler if you're really technical.
You can feel them. You get a sense for their movement. You can sense where their weight's at, and you can usually feel what they're going to do, as opposed to at range where people can disguise movements and set up things with feints. You can obviously feint in grappling and fake things, but the tactile nature of it makes it a little easier to pick things up and a little easier to be kind of the slower fighter in some cases.
Yeah. So that brings us to a strong run of prospects up on the main card here. Starting with Marina Moroz, who has a proven ground fight against Valerie Letourneau, who surprisingly isn't like for a few fights that she had, she really isn't a prospect. She's been fighting semi-regularly since 2007, which is also, to her credit, why Letourneau is looking very much like a finished product lately. So this is Moroz for me. Watching that fight against Calderwood, where she just looked way better than ever before. This is a fight against, now you're fighting somebody who probably doesn't have the emotional baggage that Calderwood did. Has a similar-ish style, not as technical a clinch game, but a really good outside kickboxer. But not a super high volume one. High enough to beat a lot of the women in front of, or a lot of the women out there, but not super high volume. And this is to me, this is a test to see, is Moroz really a good enough athlete and a powerful enough striker and a good enough striker to just absolutely overwhelm somebody like Letourneau the way she did Calderwood?
No, I think that's putting it perfectly. I think this is a good test to see because, I mean, you and I agree on the women's side, athleticism is the most important thing. And this is Valerie presents a really tough test for a young fighter. She's a pretty solid fighter in all phases. She plays a good outside striking game, though it's not exceptionally dangerous. And she's really hard to finish. So you are in for 3 rounds with her where she can fight pretty much everywhere. So I'm going to be really interested to see if Moroz is that level of grappler. Or I'm sorry, is that level of athlete. Grappler also, but is that level of athlete. Obviously, she's got Moroz has that grappling game that is kind of like the standout skill. She's hit a bunch of arm bars.
Well, she's also a coach for the Ukrainian boxing team. So
yeah.
She's got a record of having good hands too. It's just a question, I think, of consistency. Like I haven't seen any technical consistency over her career watching it, and that last fight was so brief that you can't claim that as like that's a good sign of consistency.
Pretty much any fight that you win in a minute 30, it's really hard to draw really strong conclusions about a fighter from a fight that's in a minute 30, with a couple notable exceptions. If it's like a minute 30 and it's an absolute domination in all phases of a fight, we can talk. But hitting the mat against Calderwood and then immediately throwing up an armbar, I mean, we knew that was within her game already. So, and it becomes a question of like when what else can she go to when that's not immediately available? What's going to happen when she can't submit someone inside a minute? And, a lot of people ask the same question. It's the same question you ask about any fighter who's got to run a first round finishes.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, it's got to be said that arm bars and basically submissions off your back are the least successful part of high-level MMA.
Yep.
Like you're relying on something that has the longest track record of not transferring. So you got to be really exceptional to be able to do that on the regular. That brings us to recent tough Canada, Tough Nations competitors, Chad Laprise and Olivier Aubin-Mercier, and they both. Chad Laprise has been around long enough, a little longer, not as long as you'd think. 2010 for a guy who's in his late 20s now, but Laprise seems to have kind of like a much more set style than I feel like Aubin-Mercier does. Aubin-Mercier seems like more of a guy where every time he fights, I'm like, okay, is he going to show a lot more this time? What new stuff we're going to see? He's been fighting a couple of years less than Laprise, but they both have really tough style matchups in front of them.
Yeah, Laprise is interesting because, as you said, I kind of feel like technically he's set. Like style-wise, he's found his style, and it's remarkably like Michael Bisping. Like he kind of plays a similar game, And we kind of see the fact that, like, once he hit that upper level of MMA, it started becoming a very decision-heavy results from, which isn't a huge knock. I know there's a big push in the sport for finishes for like fans and for entertainment factor, but I mean, being able to consistently win decisions at this level of MMA is pretty. It means you have a really solid process.
Yeah.
The way you fight is efficient, and it convinces judges that you're winning, and it's repeatable against multiple different styles. So it's not a bad thing.
Yep.
It's not always the most exciting thing, but it's not a bad thing. And he's got really excellent kicks. I mean, just everything about his striking is just really smooth. It's going to be interesting because Trinaldo, he's a really difficult guy to be smooth against. Trinaldo's kind of another Gleason Tebow to a certain extent. Like, he is just
an older Gleason Tebow somehow.
Yeah, he's a 155 pounder in theory. We'll see what happens with that when the IV pen hits, because like Tebow, I don't know if Trinaldo is still going to be fighting at lightweight. But he is a guy that is going to ugly up a fight. He is the prototypical Brazilian grinder, like archetypal MMA fighter. He's going to get in your face. He's going to smash you into the cage for long periods of time. He's going to try to drag you to the mat. He's going to try to squeeze you when you're down there. He's going to try to put in an arm triangle and just like squeeze your head until it pops like a pimple. Like, that's what Trinaldo does. So that is, if Laprise can get by that type of fighter, he's legitimately ready to enter the upper level of the division.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's really going to be the first really big, tough physical test like that Laprise has ever faced. I mean, maybe so, you could argue that Aubin Mercier is a pretty strong and athletic test, but much more raw. And Dennis Cedeno, for his athleticism, was both undersized as a lightweight and really just no process whatsoever. But Trinaldo's kind of, he is that guy that lightweight's full of them. The Leandro Silvas of the world, these just hulking guys that will absolutely, that will get right in front of you and stop whatever momentum you have if you can't show that you have the ability to actually hurt people in a fight.
Yeah.
Like, they will come after you every which way they can if you can't get their respect. And a lot of fighters fall down at that. And that's something that I think Laprise, this will be an interesting challenge for him, because that was even a problem against Brian Barberena, is that he couldn't quite get Barberena's respect. And as that fight went on, Barberena had a lot more success by just gritting his teeth, standing in front of Laprise and punching him back as hard as he could.
Yeah. I think pretty much at any point, if you want to be a high-level MMA fighter, at some point you're going to have to be a really hulking Brazilian who is just going to try to walk through whatever you throw at him and try to just smash you through that fence.
Yeah, especially at lightweight. That's the division where you are guaranteed to have to face that guy. On the other side, Aubin Mercier basically has a test of his fight IQ with a fighter where and his grappling ability, his wrestling ability, frankly, where he basically just needs to show everyone that he can not, he knows well enough to not strike with somebody and is consistent enough to get them down repeatedly.
Yeah. Aubin Mercier is a good young prospect, really good athlete, like a physical specimen. And he's got a really fun clinch takedown game because he comes out of judo and he's transferred a lot of the trip sweep game to the MMA clinch. So he's a lot of fun to watch fight. And he's fighting a guy in Tony Sims who, I mean, is one of the more one-dimensional fighters I feel like we've seen in the UFC in quite a while. I mean, that's not saying he's completely one-dimensional, but he obviously has a functional game. In the modern UFC, it is surprisingly reliant on boxing, and his grappling game is deficient.
Yeah, I mean, I would say he's KJ Noon's 2.0. Like, he's
Yeah.
got a better wrestling game than KJ. He comes from a wrestling background. He wrestled in college and in high school. But or in high school, I don't think he wrestled in college,
I was
actually.
gonna say I don't remember hearing that he wrestled in
Yeah, he
college.
wrestled in high school. He's got, like, he has a good takedown game,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a complicated wrestling game. So it's a sort of like the same kind of boxing basics or skill set that somebody like KJ Noons had, with just enough of a wrestling game to make that more problematic for fighters.
Yeah, and obviously Sims is a late notice replacement, right?
No, I don't believe so.
Oh, is it?
Oh yeah,
Who?
no, yeah, he is for Chris Wade. You're right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, was it? Then I was like, was it Mercier who was stepping in on short notice? Because the Chris Wade Mercier fight is an excellent fight.
Yeah. This is dangerous though, because I think if Mercier decides that he wants to play around and see how good a striker he is, because
Oh yeah,
he
he can
showed a
definitely.
willingness to do that in every fight. Sims will crack him
Yes,
really hard,
yeah. Sims will beat the snot out of him if he tries to like test his boxing
and
again.
frankly, Laprise beat Mercier with a game plan that's not that different. You
Mm,
know,
yeah, I feel like
I
Laprise.
I worry that this is going to be another bump in the road for Mercier to show that guys who can outstrike him and are at all difficult to take down are going to be kind of kryptonite.
Yeah.
The last two fighters he's faced have not been that guy since that loss to Chad Laprise.
Oh, we'll find out. This whole card is just we're gonna get a lot of information from this
Yeah.
card.
So that brings us to the main event and a larger discussion that I want to open up, especially just in reference to a few of the fighters on this card and this idea that of like what losses make or like continue to make or do actually break the idea of a prospect. And that's Max Holloway versus Charles Oliveira. Holloway is really the prospect in the works here, even though Oliveira is only 25. And we've talked about this before, but I do generally believe that Oliveira will probably be good for like another 5 or 6 years. I don't think that he's going to flame out in 3 years like he might otherwise. I think he'll get more time because he did start so young, but he may never be quite the consistent performer that other fighters who start later are. Honestly, he's already been a somewhat inconsistent performer, although he's been thrown in deep into the deep end.
He's been thrown deep in the deep end. He's been fighting for a fair amount of time, and he's packed a lot of fights into that short
Yep.
into that time. I mean, he's been fighting since 2008, and he's got 24 fights. I mean, like there are guys with 10 years in the business who have 24 fights.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Holloway and Oliveira both are guys that, like, as much as I like them, as much as I like watching them, they will almost certainly be done by 30 or shortly thereafter. Like, that's the thing, is that, Holloway maybe less so because he started taking less punishment as his technical game has improved. But that's just the way it is. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about two guys who you put them side by side, and they both have had some setbacks that I think we're gonna have to get more used to, and we should have already been used to in sort of the development of MMA. But it's a constant problem of comparison to other combat sports and comparison of a culture where title contenders and top guys and big fights and big name fighters would seemingly just kind of drop into the UFC or drop into Pride, title fight ready, and immediately be competitive at a very high level. And that's who they were. Fans would see somebody fight 2 or 3 times and they'd say, okay, I know who this guy is. I have a good idea of what he's going to do for the rest of his career.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed, and I was guilty of this for a while, was the willingness to write guys off really early.
hmm
Really early. Like the first bad loss you saw, you're like, well, that's it. Like that guy is never gonna do anything. Um
Yeah,
and
it's like, I mean, just as a quick example I could pull up off the top of my head, it's like Takanori Gomi. When he stepped into Pride, which was way back in 2004, he was suddenly this like whirling machine of death punches. He was one of the greatest lightweights in the world right off the gate. You saw him fight 2 or 3 times, and you saw his first 3 fights: knockout over Jadison Costa, knockout over Ralph Gracie, knockout over Fabio Melo. And then just a whole big string of great performances. So early on, you immediately knew, okay, Takanori Gomi, surefire badass. Thing is, before his Pride debut, he'd already been fighting for 6 years. This is somebody who already had an established career in Shudo, got all the kinks out of his game, learned all that before hitting the big stage where everyone was going to watch him. And that's what MMA fans get used to. They get used to, you see a guy at the top level, he's already there, and we're no longer there. And so because of that, we start paying attention to everyone's record all the way up, and you start to see fights and you start to see losses, and you start to see those performances that make you question how good a guy is, and often to your own detriment.
yeah, it is because it is interesting. The adjustment even the UFC had to make when it came to how do you treat young fighters. And I think Charles Oliveira is like a case study in the UFC mistreating a young fighter early on. Because you're talking about a guy who is originally fighting at lightweight, who back in 2010, still one of the deepest divisions in MMA. And Charles Oliveira runs off 2 wins.
Yep.
Against Darren Elkins and Efren Escudero. And the UFC then tosses him into the top 10 because he got 2 impressive wins. And in the old method of operation for the UFC, that's a perfectly valid way to go about it. Wow, this guy ran through 2 dudes in one of our deepest weight classes. Let's get him a top fight. And in retrospect, it's really clear that they got him in there too early.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things, and belt rank means very little in MMA, but he got knee barred by Jim Miller, and it really, really looked like a purple belt and a black belt going at it. And the purple belt technically is, a good competition purple belt is usually able to hang with and give a good competition black belt problems in the jiu-jitsu world. Like, it's kind of seen as purple belt, like you can see purple belts catching black belts. Like they can beat black belts. But usually there's just little details to their game that like the good black belts take advantage of. And in that fight, Oliveira was playing around with footlocks. He was going for Jim Miller's feet, and he left his own foot out there. And Miller scooped it up and went for a toe knee bar combo. And it looked exactly like what it was. It was a young fighter who had the athletic ability, the technical ability to play with Jim Miller, and he made one mistake because it's a position that he hasn't spent as much time in as Jim Miller. And from there, they then kind of kept it going for a little bit. He fought Nick Lenson, which he did really well in, but made some mistakes with the illegal strikes to Nick Lentz. And then they put him in there against Donald Cerrone, who's fighting Donald Cerrone as a young fighter is like a nightmare.
Yeah. And Jim Miller and Cerrone at the time were both entering sort of the beginnings of what we think of as the prime of their careers. They were at that 5-6 year mark. They'd been around a while. They'd established. They were the Takanori Gomi in this case. They were the guy who has already got their career under their belt at that point, has already developed their game pretty well. And so suddenly you're throwing somebody in there with 2 or 3 years of experience, and you're saying, take him out. You're at the top level now. You're ready. Go. And it just, the more we see over the long run, it just doesn't work like that. And coming back, then we see still at about 4 years into his pro career, he comes back and he fights Cub Swanson at the height of Cub Swanson's career. And this is, let's see, yeah, this is 2012 Cub Swanson. This is still when Cub Swanson is like right in his prime run, where he beat George Roop, Ross Pearson, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, Dennis Seaver, Jeremy Stevens, all in a row. And then he beats then he gets to fight Frankie Edgar off that loss, who was also still right in the prime of his career. Like these are now like late title contender guys, and this is off wins over Eric Wisely and Jonathan Brookins. And since that time, so we have a history of him facing good top title level or top 10 level competition early. And now, as we're starting to see Oliveira get into that same 5 or 6 year mark of his career, now he's beating Jeremy Stevens. Now he's beating Hatsuhioki. Now he's on his own run and is potentially in line for a title shot.
Yeah.
And that's not, that just, it's this idea that you can't look at those early years as indicative of all the rest, especially when a guy's facing competition at that level. Like and we'll get into some of the losses on the other side where you're like, well, that actually does mean something. But
yeah, Oliveira is one of those guys that when we're talking about like prospect losses, when you look at it, he looks like a much worse fighter than he is when you look at his record, and he doesn't have like a lot of the Jim Miller kind of is that prospect submission loss.
Yeah.
Of getting over aggressive, but then when you get into the other ones, it's really obvious he's hitting around. This is what his 7th year in professional MMA, so he's kind of peaking around the time you expect guys to peak a little bit late.
Yeah,
but he's already been given the kind of fights that you would expect a guy who's peaked to get. I mean, he was Frankie Edgar's like #1 contenders match at featherweight. Or no, he wasn't. I'm sorry. That was Frank Edgar fought BJ Penn. He was the bounce back after. I'm sorry. He was the bounce back after the featherweight fight. But it's an odd way to use a guy at that point, because I think at that point it's possible the UFC kind of had given up on Oliveira as like being a top level fighter. I mean, giving him Frankie Edgar is like, here, Frankie, you lost to Aldo. Here's a featherweight you can beat. Is kind of how that felt.
It's very similar, I feel like. It's kind of what I think of as like the Strike Force matchmaking philosophy is you know who your stars are, and you know who the guys that will put up a good fight against them, but that they will still win almost every time are. And so you keep them matched up together so that you can get your star back into the title fight.
Yeah.
So that felt like that fight.
I think Oliveira was an early demonstration of how not to handle a prospect for the UFC because of the way he just didn't really get to spend a lot of time facing that lower division. It was very much after the Donald Cerrone loss, he cast-slicered Eric Wisely and then beat Jonathan Brookings. I was like, oh yeah, go get Cub Swanson. Like, all right, there you go. Like, look, he dropped down a weight class. He can contend here. Let's toss him in there again with the top part of this weight class now.
Yeah.
And now we're finally like they gave him like a good year and a half or a good like full year now. Or no, I'm sorry. They gave him like 2 years at this point of letting him kind of bounce back from the Frankie Edgar fight, letting him recover his confidence, let him rebuild his game. And now they're giving him a well-matched fight of another young guy who they're both kind of starting to hit their peak. And now I feel like Charles Oliveira is being treated the way a fighter of his caliber and his age should be. So he's an interesting career path, and kind of I think a lesson for like the new UFC that's carrying so many prospects.
Yeah. On the flip side of that, we get, Max Holloway, or not flip side, but similar note, who had that early career submission loss to Dustin Poirier, which is basically a very aggressive fighter fighting a very aggressive guy with the submission arsenal. Dustin Poirier has always been a pretty decent grappler when he needs to be, and getting submitted. And, then he jumps right back into the fray, wins 3 lower level fights, including a close fight to Leonard Garcia. Is still only 2 years into his pro career at this point.
And can we talk about the Leonard Garcia fight for a second?
Yeah.
A fight that you kind of that's a fight that a prospect could very easily lose, because you're facing a really aggressive veteran who's not going to really let you rest at any point. He's going to keep after you. And Holloway kind of did what he had to do to win that fight. He was very kind of against type for him at times. And that's something you look for in a young prospect. When he gets pushed, can he gut out an ugly win when he needs to?
Yeah, that is actually that kind of, it reminds me of the Warley Alves fight against Alan Jouban.
Yeah,
where it's even if people think that Holloway lost, even if people think that Alves lost, they both had fights that were not going the way they wanted to, and they found ways to make that fight, to get the score, to get the judges to give them the fight, and that's really important in a young fighter. And then right after that, of course, he gets thrown in there with Dennis Bermudez.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how can you handle a grinder,
Yeah.
And I don't remember much of that fight, but I remember the split decision being somewhat justified.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that was for by the same mark, I guess you'd say that's the same kind of win for Dennis Bermudez. That's a close fight where, Bermudez showed that he could gut out a win that even if people didn't think he deserved it. You're talking at this point about very similar fighters on a very similar path with split decisions like that. And Bermudez has risen up the ranks only to find that despite his great wrestling pedigree, his lack of striking continues to be a major hindrance. And, as Holloway is rising up the ranks, he's finding that his mastery of the striking game is giving him a lot more to work with.
And I think for that fight, it was telling that he was able to be so competitive with a guy who pretty much existed in what was perceived to be Max Holloway's biggest weakness at that point, which was grappling. The level to which Dustin Poirier handled him on the ground caused a lot of people to be skeptical of Holloway early on. And the Dennis Bermudez fight was one of those fights so that is definitely improved. That it's not that hole isn't fully closed yet. He hasn't filled in that gap yet, but definite improvement on that front.
And same goes for the McGregor fight, although apparently Holloway, I think, broke his foot at some point in that fight, so there's a little...
Well, McGregor popped his knee in that fight.
But that was just a weird fight. But beyond that, and this is, again, what I've talked about with strikers and developing over the long term, is sometimes strikers take longer because their game, it takes longer to fill in the holes around a striking game and to make the striking game good enough to be, to get you over those losses or to get you over those holes.
Well, this is the only fight too that Holloway lost, lost an emphatic decision. Didn't win that fight. Looked okay at times, and I think those are the losses that really can be concerning when you're looking at prospects.
It is a concerning loss. It is a legit loss where you actually say maybe Conor McGregor is championship material because he blew out a knee and found a way to totally and easily take this fight, and maybe Max Holloway.
The saving grace for Holloway in this fight is that it came against Conor McGregor, who was a firm top-tier blue-chip guy at that point, and also really experienced.
Yep.
Far more experience than Holloway, really top-level talent. For whatever you think of, Conor McGregor and the way he beat Chad Mendes and whatever. I mean, the fact is that he's in there knocking out a dude like Chad Mendes. Like that is the only debate left on Conor McGregor isn't if he's a high level fighter anymore. It's like where he slots into the best 5 fighters in his division.
Yeah.
So that I think that's one of those things when I'm looking at prospects, when I look at a guy and he loses a fight, if it's to another top level prospect, it doesn't like dock him too much in terms of like my opinion of him. It's just like, okay, so we kind of see where in that snapshot in time he fits into the pecking order of guys like who are kind of considered to be young-ish in the sport.
Yeah. I mean, it's very much like Holloway's. What was it? It's like Holloway's win over Justin Lawrence. You'd say, like Justin Lawrence was this really touted prospect at one point, and then he faces somebody like Holloway, who's on that same path, hasn't been around longer, and Holloway beats him absolutely, and that tells you, well, okay, maybe Justin Lawrence is still a good prospect because Holloway is certainly not a bad prospect, but he's certainly not as far along as Holloway is.
Yeah.
And since then, we've seen Lawrence bounce back and slowly is building a decent career over in Bellator, or, has built a decent career in RFA, became the RFA champ, and is now in Bellator and building over there. And that's like, that's always kind of the process with a lot of these young guys, especially since they're all being pushed up into higher ranks as early as possible. They're going to be fighting a lot of guys that can potentially beat them early in their career.
Yeah, and I think just it's one of those things that I think most MMA fans who really pay attention to the sport get that, like, records are deceiving a lot of the time. And I find myself usually being more skeptical of prospects with undefeated records than I do of the ones that have 1 or 2 losses. I actually usually feel more confident about the guys where I can see a couple losses, where I can tune in and like see kind of the losses that you expect to see. Like I usually want to see one submission loss where the guy got a little overconfident and kind of learned that lesson, or a fight like Dennis Bermudez where you get in there with another guy who is the exact type of fighter you would expect to beat them, and they give it a really good fight, and they end up coming up just a little bit short. And that isn't to say that there aren't any good undefeated prospects out there. There are guys who 100% deserve all the hype that comes with being an undefeated prospect. But there's so many guys out there seeking to take advantage of that perception that they end up not really fighting anyone worth fighting. And I'd much rather see a guy with like 2 losses coming out of Ring of Combat. Than an undefeated fighter coming out of any of the number of like Gladiator Challenge or Opalette Challenge or the Opalette whatever the is it Opalette Fighting or Opalette Challenge?
Opalette Challenge, yeah.
Yeah, that one. Like, it's not a terrible promotion, but like it's not on the level of like Gladiator Challenge, but it's still like not a guy coming out of there undefeated can very easily be not as good as you'd expect him to be.
Opalatte's a major promotion used to be. I don't think that they're off to the side now, not really functioning the way they used to. But at the time, it was a major promotion functioning in a completely under talent developed market. So they, you were just getting a whole bunch of 1-0, 0-1, 0-0 guys fighting each other all the time, and getting, all the bad ones would just get crushed over and over, and there were a lot of bad ones. It's not quite, I don't think they were quite running the same racket that Gladiator Challenge is, where
I feel I shouldn't have mentioned them in the same
But no, I mean, I think it's fair. You see a guy coming undefeated out of Opalette Challenge, that doesn't mean a lot.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. But on this note too, I think, and this is one of the things I want to get to, comparing Max Holloway and say Elias Silverio, who's also on this card, and is a good prospect, a decent prospect. one of the things that I look for a lot with a loss, and I think it's more telling than anything else. And this is one of the reasons that I think, we were especially wrong to overlook Max Holloway because frankly all of his losses came against people who were willing to beat him at what was not his game. Conor McGregor took him down, outworked him. Dustin Poirier took him down, outworked him. Dennis Bermudez took him down, and it was a very back and forth fight, close fight. They both got their licks in, but he wasn't just getting massively outboxed by anyone, with maybe the exception of McGregor before McGregor injured himself. And McGregor, as we've said, he's just on another. He's a championship gunning, which, I mean, I don't know how depending on how absolutist you want to be about prospects in combat sports, you're really only a prospect if you can win a title. You're really only an actual prospect if you can win a title, I suppose you could say. But that's being really especially blunt about it.
That's rough.
It is rough. But you look at those losses, and you look at the loss Silverio had, and Silverio absolutely just got beat at his own game. And that's rougher because that really exposes not that you aren't good at what everybody knows you're bad at, but that you're not actually that good at what you think you're supposed to be good at either.
Yeah.
And that's definitely, those are the kind of losses, like Frankie Perez's loss to Johnny Case. Like, Perez had good success getting takedowns early in the fight and basically just riding top position against Johnny Case in the first round. And then after that, when Johnny Case decided to match Perez's wrestling, he was able to not only get him down, but actually beat him up and do a lot of damage from top position and just absolutely outworked him in the wrestling game. And for somebody like Perez, that's a bad sign. Like, you can't, if you're a real blue chip prospect, you don't want to be, you want to be Patrick Cummins, Patrick Cummins is getting beat up in fights or losing fights because dudes are outstriking him. He's not getting beat up and losing fights because he's just getting flat out wrestled by everyone.
Yeah.
And, if Daniel Cormier out wrestles you, that's not.
And that's
Max Holloway getting out.
On one hand, the number of people on the planet that can out wrestle Daniel Cormier.
Yeah. So that, I think, is especially what I look at as telling, is when guys who have a specialty or who are focusing even more on one thing than another do get absolutely beat there. And probably the place where that's least applicable is grappling, because it is there can be such a long learning curve with that. I think it's one of those things where if you are a grappling specialist, getting submitted by somebody is, I don't know. It feels almost not as bad, but that may just be.
It's not. I mean, like, nobody goes through a full grappling career never getting submitted.
Yeah.
Like, it happens. Like, you go through any like professional grappler's career, at some point they get submitted, because just by the very nature of engaging and being like attempting to implement offense on the ground, you are opening yourself up to counterattacks and counter offense. By passing guard, you're making it easier for the guy to submit you.
And grappling is such an absolute thing too. Like, you either get a submission or you don't. It's not like, obviously there are points and things like that, but in MMA, it's
you don't have, like, it's one of those, like, oh, I didn't, in a boxing match, you cannot get a knockout, but you can beat the shit out of somebody.
Exactly. Or in wrestling, you can get taken down and pinned, or, but still not, you then have a chance to get back up and go after the person and make sure you don't lose the whole match.
Yeah. And there are times in which guys will get damaged in grappling matches and continue, but, like, will will feel the implications of it, but it usually isn't immediately. It's usually like the next day. Guy doesn't tap to a heel hook that's close. It looks like the guy should be tapping, but it's not mangling his joint, so he toughs it out and gets out, and then like the next day he falls out of bed when he wakes up because he can't bend that leg. That'll happen. That happens more frequently, but yeah, you don't. If it's like a submission only thing or like MMA and like discounting strikes, it's very much an absolute thing where, and especially the way MMA treats grappling, the way fans treat it, like, oh, fantastic, you got the guy's back, but what did you do with it is usually the attitude.
Yeah.
That's implemented. So, yeah, I just think by its nature that I think you can pick up grappling a lot faster in some ways. Like there isn't, but it at some point, even if you're if you naturally take to grappling, you're going to have a chance to get submitted. If you grapple, if you spend enough time grappling, be it in MMA matches. John Jones, since the Vitor Belfort fight, has really toned down the amount of time he spends in people's guards. Because if you spend enough time in people's guards, it doesn't matter who you are. Eventually, if you're in there with good dudes, someone's going to latch onto something.
It's much less of a definite advantage. I think that's the thing that it's a much less bankable advantage, which is why it works less well as you go up in competition levels in MMA.
Are you talking about like a bottom game or like just in general like a grappling game?
Just in general, I think grappling it's an advantage that's less reliable.
When you get to the upper levels of the sport, you're dealing with guys where there's not a big enough skill gap for it to consistently be asserted over the course of time you spend grappling in an MMA round. Like there's not like to really dominate someone in 2 minutes, you usually need a big athleticism gap or a big skill gap.
And you usually end up having, successful grapplers end up being guys who take a lot of chances because they get submissions in a short amount of time, and the only way you tend to do that is by being willing to take the chance.
Yeah, when you get to that upper level, like Charles Oliveira, he's really athletic, he's really aggressive, and the Jim Miller fight taught him some lessons, but he does still retain a high level of aggression when he's grappling. He's willing to take risks to pursue the finish, because especially when you're talking about Oliveira's cardio abilities, he is very much in on the idea of finishing a fight immediately because he's not really, especially in this fight, he's not really built to go 5 rounds. Like as an athlete, that's not really his strength.
Yeah, and which is also why we have this idea of the prospect submission loss as being, we don't have the idea of the prospect knockout loss. Well, there's sort of an airy one floating around of basically if you see a guy who gets knocked out in 10 seconds, you don't take that seriously as an indictment of their chin.
Well, remember when it was declared that like Damian Maia had no chin because Nate Marquardt knocked him out in like 5 seconds.
Exactly. We have seen demonstrably since then that Damian Maia's chin is more or less fine. So, there's that fact too, but just in general, submission losses are not the same as seeing a guy a wrestler get heavily out wrestled or a boxer or a striker get heavily outstruck.
Yeah.
And those are the losses that, like I say, those I think are things that when I'm looking at how guys lose, like Shane Campbell, looking at his loss against John McDessie just came in and outstruck him, and Campbell's supposed to be a technical striking specialist. Or who was Joe Schilling and that Japanese guy he fought, Japanese Brazilian or Japanese French, I think.
Yeah,
guy he fought.
Superman punched him in the next week.
Exactly, and it's like that is a major indictment of Joe Schilling, like really major, because that's his wheelhouse. If he's not consistently winning those fights, then you have a lot of other questions to ask.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, prospect losses, those are, those are the ones to be cautious about. I think Chris Beal will get better, but I think his loss to Neil Seery should be if you're looking at Chris Beal as the next big thing, him getting
Yeah,
outboxed by Neil Seery is problematic because boxing is Beal's bread and butter.
yeah. And Neil Series is tough. I mean, he's a. If you just get into hand exchanges with him, he's a tough dude to beat.
He is a very tough dude to beat, and he's got a lot of experience. He's really, well-rounded.
But
He's a good fighter. I think he's a very underrated fighter. But it's still if you're talking about yourself as like the next great, top 10, top 5 fighter in the division,
yeah,
you kind of have to not be losing in your wheelhouse.
mm-hmm.
Warley Alves, he got outstruck at times badly by Alan Joban, but you put him in there to grapple against what's his name? He just fought. Oh God,
I'm not. Yeah, I'm blanking.
Warley Alves. Ah, damn it, Nordine Taleb, and he absolutely, he chokes him out with viciousness, and that's that's what you want to see. You don't want to see guys who are losing where they really should be winning, and that's what you really need to look for with prospect losses is forgive some grappling because grappling happens to everyone.
Just grappling happens.
It does. Like, I think does well, I mean, now even Jake Shields has a submission loss as well. No, he doesn't. I should say he doesn't have a submission loss yet. So grappling doesn't happen to Jake Shields.
And again, he has losses in grappling outside of MMA. But yeah, like if you're a specialist dude and you've done your time in a lot of time in grappling before you get to MMA, you can absolutely come in and never get submitted in MMA because there's just you won't spend enough time in bad position on the ground for it to happen. But I mean, we've seen jiu-jitsu world champions come in and get tapped out. I mean,
and we even saw frickin' Tim Kennedy out grapple Hodger Gracie.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you can be a phenomenal grappler and you do 2 rounds of MMA and you're gassed, and none of those credentials matter anymore.
Yeah. So forgive some grappling because on the progression scale of things, it's not as big or as bold a statement as your wrestling, which is a lot of that's transition, and your striking. But if you're looking for the losses that should really set guys back, it's when they lose to other inexperienced or relatively similarly experienced competition doing exactly the things they're supposed to be good at.
Yep.
So on that note, we got to close the show because we're running out of time. Thank you for joining me, Tom. We will be back with the 6th round on Sunday and with the more care, don't care, vivisection, all that for UFC 191 on September 5th. Demetrius Johnson versus John Dodson. Is that another break? We do have another break. So,
hey, if you're a grappling fan, ADCC is your next weekend. So if you want to spend money on that, it's pretty fantastic. 2013 was terrible because they did it in China, and like a lot of guys couldn't get visas, and the stream was awful. And like this, it's back to silly stacked brackets.
But so I think Bellator is their show next week. I think Dynamite might be next week.
Might be. Let me check. I don't have the Bellator schedule committed to memory.
Bellator is next week,
August 28th. Yes, it is.
So we will be doing a show for Bellator, a vivisection for that, and I don't know if we'll be doing all the stuff for that because there's no other big event, and Bellator Dynamite is a pretty big show to be interested in. So.
Yep.
All the normal stuff, and please, give us a thumbs up, give us a like, subscribe to MMANation.com, all that good stuff to help us out. And we will see you next week for another episode of the MMA Prospectus.